We'll take another minute or so for people who still need to come in, and then we'll get started. All right, good morning. Let's go ahead and get started for today. I hope that you had a good weekend. It seems like things are hopefully getting a little bit more evened out. No cancellations or weird things happening this week. Not a whole lot of new snow and a lot of things have melted. So things are looking okay as we go into week 2. So I want to start out for today with a short prompt that I'll be asking you to do on your own and then share with us in the class. Starting this week, we will be taking regular attendance. The way I like to do attendance in classes is through some type of activity or prompt that you're either doing with others or on your own, just as a way to help us apply and think about things in class so far. It'll also be a really nice way for us to get to know each other better too. So to start out for today, what I'd like you to do is write or type. So you're welcome if you prefer to type and have a device with you. You can always type up your response and email it to me, or you can write it on paper and pass it forward at the end of class. What I'd like you to take some time to think about for today are 2 things that you feel like you do pretty well as a listener. And then 2 things that you feel like you could do to improve as a listener, right? A lot of this class is designed to help you reflect on and think about your own strategies as a listener and the ways that you see yourself as capable of growth. For instance, I could say that as a listener, oftentimes I do a good job of understanding the content or the thing the person is trying to say, but sometimes I try to predict what the other person is going to say before they say it and miss kind of the end of their message. Take a little bit of time to think about these, write or type these. give you a couple more minutes to work on this, and then I will ask us to go around and share. So you might choose one among what you've written you're comfortable sharing with the group. Anyone who would like more time on this? All right. So why don't we go around and we'll go around the class, share some of the things you thought about in terms of what you do well as a listener, things to work on. Also remind us of your name, since we're still in the process of getting to know each other. So let's start here on the side.
You want us to share both of the two things, or just kind of like one that you do good is like you do well and one that you improve on?
Yeah, so you're welcome to share whatever you're comfortable with. So if it's just one or both.
Okay. My name is Justin Jeske, and one thing that I think I do well is I always let the person finish what they're saying, so don't interrupt. And then one thing I think I need to work on is actually listening and not letting like my own thoughts alter what they're actually saying, so make it more about them, not about me.
So thanks, Justin.
My name is Macy. One thing that I think I do well as a listener is using my body language and facial expressions to show that I'm actively listening. And one thing that I think I can work on is, especially when I'm listening to whether it's a lecture or a conversation with someone, and if the content is something that I'm really interested in, sometimes like I'll start thinking about other things related to it. So I think just making sure I'm focused on what the person is telling me and not letting my mind wander.
Sure. We're actually going to talk about that in just a minute, Macy, because our minds work a lot faster than our speaking, right? So that can get us off track or off base as we're hearing somebody talk. So thanks for sharing. Yeah.
I'm Nicole. One of the that are in responding listening, so it's like physical cues, all that stuff. And something that's a little bit is my evaluating listening skills. So it's like actually being able to time like specific. I get very distracted and go on for hours.
Yeah, and the nonverbal cues from others associated with that, you know, can definitely be an added challenge to figure out what somebody else is doing in response to our message, for sure.
Trevor, I'd say I'm really good at critically listening and critically thinking. And I'm horrible at not letting someone finish because I'm so eager to get a point out, especially either in a debate or in a casual conversation.
Yeah.
And it's really unprofessional, but it happens to absolutely everyone.
Yeah, it's a challenge, right? Because with like things like culture and upbringing, that can play a big role. So my partner grew up in a pretty big family, had a lot of siblings, and so everybody was talking over each other all the time. I grew up in a much smaller family, so there was a lot less of that. So sometimes we have a clash in communication style because we come from those different backgrounds. We're just used to communicating in different ways. So that's definitely a major challenge that can come up. Yeah.
I'm on crew. I'd say I'm pretty good at empathizing with people and like understanding the emotions they feel when they're having something, so I can respond better. And then I can probably improve with like daydreaming or fading out of conversations if I'm not actively part of it, like speaking, have a speaking role. or if I'm being directly spoken to.
Yeah, if you're not a direct part of the conversation, it can be a lot easier to drift out of focus, right? For sure. Yeah.
My name's Destiny, and then one thing that I do well as a listener is using nonverbal cues. And then something I could definitely improve on is recalling. 'Cause when I know that I have to recall something for some reason, like I can't focus.
Yeah,
And then I have a hard time repeating what was said.
yeah. Especially if there's pressure, right? You feel the pressure to, oh geez, what's the thing that I'm supposed to remember? When in a casual conversation, it might come more naturally. Or sometimes you don't remember the exact word that you want to describe something, right? Things like that. Presley?
I'm Presley. I feel like I'm good at like taking in information, trying to understand where a person's coming from. One thing I can work on is asking more open-ended questions, like just get a better viewpoint of where someone's at.
Yeah, yeah. Open-ended questions are great when you're trying to get a lay of the land and figure out where the other person is coming from and how they feel. Like, yeah.
My name's Fatima, and two things, the listener is also hearing both sides of the story and trying to see and understand the impact of the situation. In the areas I need to be worked on mostly when I'm trying to make a schedule and people just come in and talk to me, but I need to go somewhere else. I'm not trying to be rude, just cut them off, but
Yeah,
mostly I try to go back to them later on.
yeah. That connects to our discussion about time-oriented listening too, right? Feeling like there's pressure when you're talking with somebody to get the message out and the amount of time you have available, that can definitely be a big distraction.
My name is Zach, and I think one thing that I do pretty well is letting people finish their point before I talk over them. One thing that I do bad or need to improve on is probably one word responses in a conversation. So
Yeah.
like things like, yeah, okay, or
Yeah.
stuff like that.
That can be especially challenging in something like text, right? If somebody responds with yes or K, or doesn't even respond, but like reacts to your message with a thumbs up or something, right? There's a lot of ways that listening can be challenging, especially if the response makes it difficult for the person to understand and figure out where they're coming from, for sure. Just bring that up. Yeah.
And my name's Willie. I said that I'm pretty good at like making eye contact in a conversation, just listening, because you don't just listen like with your ears, like you listen with your eyes, like when you're looking at something else. It's hard to focus on. If I was having a conversation with you, but I was over there like looking at what Kaden was writing, I would be listening as well. But I said something I struggle with is like I'll be texting someone and someone will be talking to me and I'll be like, what are you even talking about? Because I don't, it just went in one ear and out the other.
Yeah, right. It can be a challenge with multitasking too. How many folks consider themselves to be okay to pretty good multitaskers? Okay, a few of you, right? I'm somebody who like has to be laser focused on one thing, like I put on my headphones and just like focus. So depending on your style and your way of communicating with others, multitasking can definitely be a big distraction or something that helps you with listening too.
My name is Kanan. One thing I feel like I was good as a listener is trying to be an empathetic listener towards the people I'm talking to, trying to understand where they're coming from. One thing I feel like I could work on is not interrupting as much. I think I try to show that I'm being an active listener, but the interruptions are kind of rude.
Yeah, it's hard then, right? Like as folks have mentioned, like Trevor, right? It's hard when you are eager to get something in or add to the conversation.
One thing you said I was good at listening wise was understanding urgency. Knowing people's voice, how important the information is, that sort of things. The thing I need to work on is just staying focused on listening generally. Sometimes I just space out without even realizing it.
Yeah, I like the way that like picking up on things like tone and nonverbal signals can just like, if somebody suddenly talks to you in this deadly serious voice, you're like, whoa, okay, what's up? You need to talk, right? That's a way that those kind of cues can help us a lot.
I'm Mari, pretty good at empathizing with people, so that kind of helps, but I sometimes just zone out.
Yeah.
That doesn't help as much.
Yeah, it's oftentimes we'll try to listen and we'll listen for a while, but then we'll kind of drift away, right? Keeping listening through the whole time can definitely be a challenge.
My name is Johnny. One thing I'm good at is making eye contact with the person speaking, and then one thing that I can work on is not fake listening so much because I zone out a lot.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute, but the sort of fake or pseudo listening style is definitely a thing that comes up a lot. And something that we do, as you mentioned, when we feel like we're zoning out or have difficulty focusing.
My name is Travis. One thing I do good is I'm usually pretty available if someone needs to talk. I don't know if that's it. And one thing I can work on is not trying to like problem solve immediately after someone says something. Like just kind of sitting there and listening because they don't.
Yeah, right. So the like action-oriented listening style where you want to come up with a solution is not always where the other person is at that moment. So that can definitely, be a big difference there too. Yeah.
I'm Malia, and I would say a thing that I'm good at is patience and adaptability in communication. I personally work with adults and kids with disabilities, and some of them are nonverbal, so
Right.
I have to adapt to different types of communication through nonverbal cues or like through speaking device and such.
Yeah.
One thing that I can improve on, the first thing is more in my professional life, but in my personal life, siblings or parents and stuff, I would say that in times of like arguments and such, I'm pretty bad about negative feedback. So I'll like very obviously, if someone says something that I think is like a weird behavior, or their comments are unnecessary, I'll like specifically not make eye contact or just ignore it.
Yeah, right. Like sometimes there's this thing somebody says in a conversation and it raises a red flag. And even as the conversation continues, right, you just keep coming back to that thing. That can definitely be a challenge for listening. And figuring out when and how to address that can be a challenge too. So I'm glad you all shared and brought up some of the things that stood out to you about good and bad listening. Some of the things that I noticed overall seems like a lot of strengths people were identifying were elements of nonverbal communication, right? That's a big part of how and why we communicate. There's so much of the message that's conveyed through our eyes, through our body language, through our use of physical space, right? I like that. I also was interested in the way folks brought up, feeling like they're losing focus or drifting, feeling like they want to participate or jump in on a conversation when it might not be appropriate to. So those kind of cognitive levels of attention and focus are definitely things to hang on to. Since in this class, including for one of your assignments, I'm going to be asking you to reflect on your own listening. So this is a useful way to help to prepare you for what we'll be doing over the course of the quarter. So thanks for doing that and getting us started on some of these ideas. Last class, we talked about different types of listeners, right? People-oriented, time-oriented, and so on. We also defined what listening was and its significance, and some of the different situations that we find ourselves listening in, such as listening to scan and gather data versus listening to try to empathize with somebody else. Again, these 4 types that we discussed last week, people-oriented, right, are interested in who the person is. Action-oriented, want to find a solution, what can I do to help? Content-oriented are interested in the information as it is, like solving a puzzle. And then time-oriented listeners are really concerned with a schedule and managing the time that's available. Last week, we also talked about how listening is a 5-stage process, right? As folks brought up, listening is not just with your eyes, it's with your ears, with all of your senses, right? And that listening is not just picking up on vibrations with our ears, but it involves not only getting the message, but making sense of it, understanding it, remembering it later, right? Like when we're on the spot, understanding and evaluating the message. Again, critical thinking. If you're reading a headline and it's from The Onion, you know it's a satirical news site and not actually the news. So you're going to evaluate that differently. And then responding, right? Using feedback, nonverbal communication, nodding, even jumping in on the conversation. And then we talked toward the end of last week about these 4 different types too, right? Where we listen to discriminate or pick up on things in our environment, right? Where's the dog in the yard? We use it to receive information, like maybe you're getting an exam review before a major test. We listen critically, try to understand and figure out if the information is correct or we believe in it. we listen to empathize, right? To put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and figure out the perspectives of other people. So that's a kind of quick review of things we went over last week. Again, the slides and video are available for last week for you to go back to. As a reminder, the first quiz is due this Wednesday. So on January 12th, you'll need to complete that quiz. If you haven't already done so, again, it's open note, open book. You have limited time to complete it, and it covers content from week 1 reading, as well as the syllabus. Normally, your quizzes are going to be due on Sundays, right? So this next quiz, the week 2 quiz, is going to be due this Sunday. Just to review real quick, go to Canvas for this course. You'll be able to access all the things that you need. So again, I post the quiz over here on the right. I also post the reading for that week. And then I post the video and slides for that day if you've needed to miss class. I also post the slides before class starts. So the slides for today are available as we're working through things if you need any help or just need to refer to those as we're working through it. So again, that stuff is coming up. So we reviewed some of these key ideas from the class and also heard from you about listening. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the barriers and factors that can make our listening not go so well. And then some of the ways that we can deal with and address barriers in listening. One thing that was brought up over the course of people talking today is active listening. And that's something we'll be getting into more on Wednesday. But it's the way that we can use a listening style that really helps us to address the concerns that many of you brought up. So if we think about listening as this 5-step process, right? It involves all of these things in order to understand and make sense of a message and making it meaningful for us. You could think about things going wrong at every single stage, right? So you, for instance, are talking to a friend and your friend is telling you about their classes, right? There could be barriers that are impacting the receiving stage. Like maybe they're talking really quietly and you can't hear them. Maybe issues at the interpreting stage. They're using an abbreviation or they're talking about a class and you don't know what that class is. Issues with recalling. They've told you about the class, but you can't remember what the class was that they talked about. Issues with evaluating. Maybe you can't figure out if they should really be frustrated with this class that they're in, or if maybe they are overthinking it. And responding, right? When do you jump in or nod or address what it is that they're saying? So if you think about it, right, the barriers and the issues you all talked about impact every stage of the process. You're drifting out of the conversation, you might not receive parts of the conversation, right? If you're cutting off somebody, maybe that's impacting your ability to interpret and understand because you're listening to respond rather than listening to comprehend, right? So if we think about listening as having all these parts, these barriers can impact this entire process. So one of the major ways that listening can be impacted, right, is by noise. So physical noise is probably the easiest way to think about this, right? If you're walking down a street and you're talking to somebody and there's somebody with a jackhammer and they're like working on the road, it's going to be really hard to hear the other person. You're going to be really interrupted. You're going to cut off. So physical noise comes from the environment, and that can impact other things too, right? If everybody's talking in a loud room or jackhammers going off, then maybe you have less opportunity to recall and to focus on your message. So it can come physically. Noise can also be physiological. So say you have a really bad headache, right? You woke up with a bad migraine and you're talking to somebody. It's going to be a lot harder to understand the person and their message when that physiological noise is happening, when the pain, or if you're really hungry, right? You're focused on that rather than focused on what's going on. And then thirdly is psychological noise, right? So if you've ever read or seen or heard, right, of Winnie the Pooh, there's this classic character, Eeyore, right? And Eeyore is the sad donkey who has like a rain cloud over his head a bunch of the time, right? That's psychological noise, right? So for Eeyore, if he's hearing a message, he's going to interpret it as just being like the most pessimistic way possible. Like, hey, isn't this a great day today? He might say, well, I don't know. We'll see what happens, right? So that's psychological noise. Our mood, how we're feeling in that moment is definitely going to filter the message. If we're excited, we're pumped up, or we're combative, we might be more likely to cut off somebody's message, right? And that's psychological noise too. So you can think about these different types of noise as what's physically happening, what's going on with us, with our bodies, and also what's going on with our mood, our personality, and so on. Another key idea here, right, and one that Macy brought up, is that we oftentimes will think a lot faster than we speak, right? So if somebody's talking, they're using that process of figuring out their message, explaining their message to somebody else, and so on. You're listening, you're taking in that message, but something like a sentence does not take a whole lot to understand or follow along with. So as you're listening, your mind might go to other places. You might start to think about, for instance, in the class, hey, what am I going to go get for lunch? What am I going to do when this class is over, right? Because you have more time mentally to do that. So one of the challenges is dealing with our minds outpacing ourselves and trying to bring them back or help to refocus them on the conversation. So there's some other barriers that can impact our listening process too. And again, you don't need to get everything down word for word, since I do have those slides up for you as well. I just like to review some of these key ideas. So one of the ideas here is selective listening. And you can think about selective listening as a survival strategy, right? We use selective listening as a way to make sense of the world. If you're sitting on a park bench and you're trying to read a book, and you got somebody like on their phone, you've got a bunch of traffic, you've got a bunch of stuff going on, right? You're going to try to tune out. You are going to use selective listening to focus on the thing that's important to you. So selective listening can be a good thing if it lets us focus, but it can also be a problem if we're only paying attention to a part of the message. So for instance, right, maybe you have a good friend in this class who were interested in understanding how they see themselves as a listener. You focused on them and focused on what they had to say, but maybe you didn't dedicate as much attention to listening to other folks in the class share. That could be an example of selective attention, picking the things that you're interested in or that you want to focus on. And again, a lot of times we use that as a strategy to survive and to focus, especially if we've got limited amount of time to focus and dedicate our mental energy. Response preparation, right? So if you've ever seen something like a debate, right, like a presidential debate like we had in 2020, then we know that oftentimes listening is not about understanding the other person. It's about finding something to say back to the other person, right? This is something that folks like Trevor brought up too, that oftentimes we don't listen because we really want to understand what they have to say, but because we're finding a way to prepare and rehearse what we say, right? So it's not only that we think of the next sentence, we might go over and over it again in our heads. For instance, as we were going around the room, it's likely that the person that was right before you, somebody that you weren't listening to quite as closely, because you said, you know what, I'm going to be speaking next, so I'm going to rehearse and prepare what I'm going to say next, right? So response preparation is oftentimes something that lets us miss messages. One idea that's important to this class and important to the process of listening as a whole, right, is that listening is a two-way street. I think it's unfair to just say, hey, you need to be a good listener. You need to be a better listener, right? Because being a good listener also means the message is worth listening to and is a good message that you're picking up on, right? If somebody is bad at speaking and at talking to you and being clear, that makes your job as somebody listening and trying to understand that message a lot harder. To give you an example, say you are trying to listen to a presentation that's given on campus, like we have a guest speaker coming to campus, right? As they're talking to you, their microphone is not working, or their microphone has a ton of interference, right? There's a good chance because of that, you're not going to hear them very well, or that microphone is going to be a distraction. So sometimes the source itself needs to be responsible for creating a message worth listening to, right? Of making sure the audio is working and that they're being clear. So sometimes that can be a big issue, right? If the source itself is not communicating clearly, communicating in the way that it could, then that's a problem. And then lastly is prejudice listening, right? So you can think about it as us oftentimes putting up a shield. So if there is a message that we know completely goes against our values or beliefs or what's really important to us, we will oftentimes put up a shield in order to protect ourselves from the message, right? So this is especially true for folks that might be different from you in terms of things like political, social beliefs, right? You're listening to them share that message. And oftentimes one of the first things that our brain does, right, is dismiss it, say, well, you're wrong, I don't agree with this, and so on. And that could very well be true, and in some situations be a good thing for you to do. But it also means that you're not going to follow or understand the messages closely. So even if you do disagree strongly with some of the things they're saying, you're still not getting a full sense of their message, right? And that can be a useful strategy because understanding and fully engaging with a perspective you disagree with helps you to become better at developing your own perspective and idea, right? It's the know thy enemy approach. Understanding a perspective you disagree with will help you better engage with that perspective, even if it's something like a debate. So those are some barriers that can impact listening. And in addition to those, there's also some straight up bad ways that we choose to listen. And we're going to do an activity in just a little bit that'll ask you to incorporate some of these elements of bad listening. So there's a lot of different ways that we do bad listening. And some of you brought them up already at the beginning of class, particularly the idea of pseudo listening. Let's talk about it. Pseudo listening, right, is, as people brought up, trying to show that you're listening and paying attention, but not actually doing so in a way that it's showing that you're listening without actually listening, right? So if you talk to somebody and you find that they're using aha, yeah, similar types of nonverbal and verbal responses, but they don't feel appropriate, like you're talking to somebody, hey, I'm going to the store today, and yeah. And then I went to the store afterwards, and yeah, like they're just cutting off the middle of your sentence, and it doesn't make sense when they're non-verbally or verbally responding. Or somebody just starts nodding at random parts of your sentence. That's pseudo listening. And we oftentimes pick up on and get frustrated with it if it's clear to us that the feedback we get from somebody does not match up with what it is that we're saying, because it shows us that they're not really listening. We might be a little bit better at it and follow along certain points where we think we can give nonverbal feedback to show that we're listening. But this is a general practice that we do a lot, right? Is pretending that we're listening so that our minds can be elsewhere, or we have the minimal amount of work that we need on the issue. We also have narcissistic listening, right? So if you're familiar with the Greek story of Narcissus, right? He was somebody who fell in love with his own reflection, right? And looked at his reflection so much that he died and became a flower, right? The narcissus flower. In the same way, right? Narcissistic listening is self-centered. It's making it about you, right? It's not just the message, it's retooling the message to make it about yourself. So if, for instance, we were having a conversation and celebrating a good friend's birthday, right? And you're talking to that friend and talking about how great it is that they had this birthday. And then all of a sudden, another person comes in and says, hey, I just got a new puppy. Check out my photos, right? That's narcissistic listening. That's changing it to be about them or changing the message to be about yourself. And that can be at times hurtful for a friendship or relationship when there needs to be a focus on that other person and on that relationship. Aggressive listening, right, is listening that is designed to attack. So this is something we see happen a lot if people are in a major argument or debate with each other, right? It's listening not just to respond, but to respond by attacking the person, right? So maybe you're disagreeing about chores to do around the house. Somebody says, hey, I am really frustrated. I feel like I've been taking out the trash. And somebody responds by saying, oh, you always say that you take out the trash, right? It's listening with the intention of attacking somebody based on their message, finding an opening to retaliate against somebody. Eavesdropping, right? So eavesdropping, being a fly on the wall, is when you are intentionally listening in on a conversation that you're not supposed to, right? Another example, right, is wiretapping. That can be a practice of eavesdropping. So eavesdropping is not accidentally stumbling in on the conversation that you're not supposed to. It's intentional, right? It's putting a glass cup to the wall or choosing to be at a certain place at a certain time, knowing that a conversation is going to happen, right? Or standing by the door when you're supposed to be outside. And then lastly is distorted listening, right? Distorted listening means that there is a misunderstanding or mishearing of the message, right? So for instance, if you were to say, I'm currently 26, and you remember it as, oh, this person is 28, right? That gap is distorted listening. And unfortunately, that's a thing that we do all the time because we're humans. Our memory is faulty. There's going to be things that we inevitably forget, right? Distorted listening just means that the thing that we remember and the thing that was said were two different things. There's some type of gap or missing part that could come through misinterpretation in that process. So those are some bad listening practices for us to think about. What I'm going to have us do now is a fun little activity that asks us to apply and think about some of these negative practices of listening. So what I'm going to be doing is giving every one of you a slip of paper. And the slip of paper gives you a role. So your role could be totally normal, you could be a regular speaker, or you could wind up being a bad listener. Don't tell other people in your group what your role is. What I'm going to ask you to do is talk to your group about, for instance, how the new year is going, how your classes are going, and so on. If you are a normal listener, great, just do your thing. But if you are assigned a bad listener, I'm going to ask you to act out that style of bad listening as you're hearing to people talk. So one thing that you might do over the course of your conversation is try to figure out among the bad listeners who they are and what their bad listening is. Right? So again, you'll be given a role. Don't tell other people your role, but you'll be talking and then listening in a way that lines up with your role. So we'll have a group of 6 here. We'll have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 5. And then we'll have everybody else. So I think that's another group of 5 over here on this side. So group 1, group 2, group 3. And we'll give paper to each group. Take one and pass it around to your group. one, pass it around.
I'll be aggressive.
Round. Yeah, just feel free to chat about the new year, about your classes. And as you're talking, right, fulfill your listening role.
How's everyone's classes going?
Yeah. Took me out, like one of those.
Really?
Yeah. Or a transfer. I don't know.
That's crazy. Yeah. My high school. Senior year. Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I don't watch
Yeah, I have jobs too.
Alright, what kind of job Come on, man.
Writer for the student newspaper and the university.
I just worry about that.
I mean, there's nothing to do there. I actually don't want to teach with him. Yeah, I know. So pretty there. Yeah. I wanna move there,
No idea what to talk about.
Yeah, but I like it.
I mean,
Yeah.
So give you a minute or two to continue your conversation. Again, try to figure out your roles. No.
It's hard to be distorted. I know.
All right. All right, so let's chat about this. There are some fun conversations being acted out. All right, so I'm curious. Let's start over here with this group. What were the bad listeners you identified?
Aggressive, distorted, and narcissistic.
Yeah, so there was some kind of fun acting out there. What made it stand out to you? What did you notice about the bad listeners? What was their power?
I would it's like, you didn't talk the entire time, so I couldn't give it away.
Yeah.
And then at the end, yeah, and at the end, he was like, oh, you're from this, but it was wrong, you know, or you
Oh,
went to
okay.
this, and it was wrong.
Yeah, so like picking up on just information that's just blatantly false, right? It's a good sign, like if somebody just is totally off of what you're saying, just sort of listening. But this group here in the middle, what were the bad listeners that you all identified?
One of them was an impression,
Uh-huh.
and there were two people that were.
Good pseudo listener as well.
Okay. Yeah, what were the things that helped you to figure those people out?
What will we get to? The first, when we're talking about sports, what kind of story they're going for,
Mhm.
and you have to be actually playing that game, and it's like, I already know what they're actually.
Obvious backhanding.
It's kind of fun because, right, like a pseudo listener, being really good at being a pseudo listener, is just going to blend into the group and not be the person that you find out is not really listening. Kind of like Among Us, right, where there's the imposter who's pseudo listening instead of real listening. Put this group back here.
Ours was pretty easy because only one of us had a thinking.
Yeah.
Disorder.
Okay. Yeah. How did you figure out that distorted listening?
At first we thought we were all normal, so we asked if somebody said no, and then she got it incorrect or like said it
Sure.
incorrectly.
Oh, okay. That's a smart way to do it as you're going around and sharing. Awesome. So I thought this would be a kind of fun way to help us think about and to remember some of the styles of bad listening, right? And another thing that I think is kind of fun, right, is it's kind of silly as we're working through them. We're like, oh, hey, it's 4 o'clock. No, it's 3 o'clock, right? There's obvious ways somebody's listening badly, but also these are things that we do in ways that are a lot less obvious, right? We still use narcissistic listening and make things about us, even if it's not as obvious. We use aggressive listening where we're responding to messages, attacking the other person, and so on. So these are things that, even though we were doing it in kind of a silly way this time around, are still a lot of parts of our everyday conversation. So again, I noticed a lot of interesting ways that people were bringing in those bad listening styles, but I thought that the fact that you could pick up on it like really quickly, be like, oh, this person's a narcissistic listener, or this person is a distorted listener, right? Tells us that we as humans have a really good ability to pick up on bad listening, to be frustrated with it, to respond to it, and so on. So I think it's important to keep in mind our capacity to understand when listening is not going well. So to wrap up for today, we talked about some of the things that negatively affect our listening, right? People deal with barriers, including the physical noise and distortions that we have that affect our messages. We also talked about bad listening practices, again, things like aggressive, pseudo listening, and so on. Eavesdropping was not one that we included, although it would have been kind of fun to have somebody like try to jump over to another group. And then identifying some of the ways that we listen badly can help us to combat it and deal with it more effectively through our own communication. So on Wednesday, we'll be talking about active listening and some of the ways that we can become good listeners and address a lot of the things that may have come up over your conversations. So if you wrote down your prompt for today, please pass that forward, and I'll do that for attendance. If you typed up your prompt for today, please email it to me if you haven't done so already. Otherwise, have a great day, and I will see you again on Wednesday. Yeah, you can just toss the paper.
Yeah.